So in the Kantian sense, there was a notion of proliferation, of rampant growth of a system of pure reason, which wasn't kind of kept in check by an encounter with the world, and thus this would keep growing in a sense. And what has happened kind of progressively with idealism, with metaphysics, is that even this sort of attempt at keeping in check the axioms has been incorporated in this system of cybernetics. It has been incorporated in the way that whenever a system reaches its limitations, then the system is just technically continued. So technics has become the kind of logical system of logic itself embedding itself within a metalogic. So you get like the technological system attempts to replace every limit of its production by finding a technical solution for it and removing that kind of technical contradiction and replacing it with another. So what you get is, for example, if you have two contradictory claims that arise from an inconsistent logical system, then there is an algorithm in place that solves this issue by always removing one of these claims, either the positive or negative one, and incorporating it artificially as an additional axiom, and then just let the system grow further. So one has, let's say, a way of overcoming the limitation of the system by putting in another system, a superordinate system that can replace them. So this can be seen as the continuous development of metaphysics, and it has been entirely formalized in this Hegelian system, where you have this arising contradiction and the incorporation of this contradiction into a higher system. And ideally it is seen as some sort of progress towards further truth. However, the core of metaphysics, the core of truth, the core of essence has been negated, has been done away with. So what it does now is performing this process of further integration into further systems of control without any actual, let's say, transcendent purpose. So this sort of integration of the ego within the self has been kind of solved by dissolving both, by dissolving the ego, by ending this pursuit in itself. Whereas there's this famous notion of Douglas Hofstadter in A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, that it is not that the question isn't solvable or that the question is difficult to solve. It is perhaps the wrong questions that have been asked. And thus, perhaps the approach is in a process of transformation, and it needs to twist and find a way through this entire negation, through this technical nihilism of the entire system. You can see that in this image that I'm portraying here, that you have this sort of map, this sort of territory that is being deterritorialized, that is being deconstructed, and that is kind of in the mode of production, constantly reconstructing itself to deconstruct even further, as we've talked about. And this is the entire process of this increasing embedding of higher order systems within higher order systems, is just for its own sake, is this continuous technologization. So in a way it is a thorough controlled demolition instead of a disaster, an explosion, let's say, of just wildfire. It is a, let's say, surgical deconstruction that goes further and goes further and has taken on its own kind of dynamic. And these kind of re-territorializations that happen, they happen in malignant ways so that they are just prepared for the next deterritorialization. And the essential kind of trajectory, the essential goal of integration, of individuation, is the attempt to generate this sort of summit, this sort of integration that does not lend itself to be further produced by the machinations of techniques. It is something that is meant to be outside of its grasp, and thus something that evades its influence, and in a way it, however, cannot live outside of it. Like, we are not able to live outside of techniques. I'm not able to explain these things and convey these things if I was just living in the trees, and the system would still be there if I lived in the trees, and perhaps it would at some point take me down from the trees. So the approach is something that follows the flows of techniques, so it embraces the shadow, it embraces the collective technological nihilism of the shadow, and what it does is that it re-emerges and uses these forces of re-territorialization to establish a coherent whole again. And that is something that is thoroughly possible. It is something that represents this sort of essential spark and blind spot that is talked about in many narratives and legends, such as, let's say, the Lord of the Rings, where you have the essential darkness that has spread being confronted by the most pure, weakest, small link of pure heart, that leads to the ultimate apotheosis, the ultimate rise of the narration to the narrator, by means of establishing this ultimate opposition, this ultimate, let's say, growth of the shadow, and the incorporation of the hero or the ego with it. And this leads us to the final slide in this lecture series, and that is the map of Jung, which perhaps we have now a better understanding of. So on the one hand, we've got the idea of the big soul and the small soul, the large sagacity and the I, the ego and the self, the small circle embedded in the big circle, which represents a distinction that is not a polarity, but a distinction between narrator and narrated subject, or not subject, but narrated, let's say, character or persona or per person. And that is that which leads on the surface of this self, which is by means of the ego within it sectioned off into a dark aspect, namely that of the shadow that is cast down, that lives in this polarity of ego and shadow. And then furthermore, we've got this sort of sense that this is not some other world that is embedded within us somewhere, but it is something that is in the world. The world itself entails this sort of non-disclosure and concealment. And what we've got is just this kind of sense of outer and inner world, but they originate from the same original source of Dasein, of being in the world and being in a relationship to being itself. And lastly, this kind of structural unity of the self that unites the kind of internal and external aspect is exemplified by the structure of language and production and society which we experience in our everyday life. And so the structure and the mode of what is going on in our unconscious is not something to look for in the spirit realm, but something that we can concretely see in the way techniques unfolds itself and the way techniques discloses entities to us. I hope you've learned something in this lecture series, and I will see you in one of my next videos. Thank you very much.